Hey guys, so today we're gonna make a epoxy cone nightlight. And first, what I'm doing here is I am making the form with plexiglass. This is about 1/8 inch thick plexiglass. Cutting this on a table saw, and also I have the edges taped just to help protect from chipping and stuff like that. To join these pieces of plexiglass, I'm using packing tape. Any type of clear tape or any tape that you can use to make a nice tight joint, I found works out better than hot glue. However, you can always use whichever method you feel is best. But usually what I do is I tape it, get it all together, and then once that's completed, I make sure I go over everything thoroughly with as much tape as I feel is necessary to make sure I don't have a leak. If you do get a leak, in my experience, the only thing you can do is add compression some kind of way. So whether you add extra tape or a clamp and a rag, in my experience, only adding some type of pressure or force is the only thing that's going to slow it down until it can start to set up. So here with the pine cones, I'm just kind of getting a rough fit to see what's going to look good, and I'm just taping that in place so that way it doesn't float when I pour the epoxy. However, I do change my plans here in a bit. This is a two-part epoxy art resin, 1:1 by volume, equal parts. And I'm just using a transparent green resin dye and blue to get a base color and also to glue down the bottom layer of the pine cones here. Link in the description to all of the products that I use. So this is my pressure pot. If you don't have one, they come in handy quite often. And what it does is you put your epoxy in here, you compress it to about 40 or 50 psi, and it shrinks all the bubbles down to where they're not visible anymore. So it looks bubble free. Apparently there's bubbles still in there, but they're so small you can't really detect them with your eye. So I let that set overnight, and what I'm doing here is I'm just creating some scratches, just trying to give the epoxy some tooth for the deep pour epoxy to adhere to. And so here I am retaping it, because if you pour anything with epoxy, if you have anything in there that will float, like wood, pine cones are pretty similar to wood. They're porous, and they are whatever it is that makes wood float, less dense, I guess. It will float. So if you don't put weight on it, or if you don't compress it down in some form, it will float. This is a 2:1 deep pour epoxy called epoxy. Also link in the description for a link to Amazon. This is a deep pour epoxy. It's one of the better deep pour epoxies out there. I do recommend using it. With this epoxy, as well as any other epoxy, you want to mix very well for several minutes. And you also want to scrape the sides to make sure you don't have any epoxy unmixed that's sticking to the walls. That being said, also when you pour it, the last bits that come out of anything you're pouring epoxy that are in the container are likely going to be the unmixed parts. So I choose to not ever completely pour out. I just pour out the contents, and whatever's sticking to the walls, I just let it kind of stick to the walls. I don't scrape it, because likely that is an unmixed portion and that could ruin your epoxy projects. So I'm going for a slightly cloudy look, and I've got all these colors mixed up. I want like different colors to be in different parts of this pine cone light, and I don't know if it's going to work out. I've never done it like this, and it's always tricky when you're mixing up anything other than a clear resin, because sometimes you don't know if you've gone too far and made it too opaque or not transparent. So this is a trial and error kind of thing, and if you work with epoxy, then you know that to be true. Since this is a very large pour, a relatively large pour, my plan is to use my little mini fridge to slow down the exothermic reaction. So if you were to just let this sit out, it would definitely overheat, and you'd get bubbles, and you'd probably get some cracking, and who knows what else, all the bad things that you don't want. So my plan with this was to pour it, put it in my mini fridge, which will slow down the exothermic reaction, and it will take longer, but my plan was to just pull it out of the fridge for a couple hours here or there to get it to warm up and not overheat, and then put it back in. I did let it sit out overnight one night when I didn't want to, so it did have a slight exothermic reaction on one of the tops. I was easily able to fix that, and overall it worked, even though I did fail in that aspect. There was only one small part on the top that kind of messed up right there on that corner, as you can see. But other than that, I was able to fix it, and everything worked out fine. Now, sometimes some of the most difficult parts of the project is actually getting the epoxy out of the mold, and pretty much you just use whatever tools and whatever process you can to demold that thing. I found that a chisel and a hammer sometimes works best. I even used silicone demolding spray in this, and it was still quite difficult to demold. But that chisel and carefully getting that in between the plexiglass and the resin seemed to work out really well. My plan for this piece, I was going to try to go for a perfect pour with a perfect mold and try to demold it and not have to do any sanding, but I've never had that work out, so I had to clean it up on a chop saw. And if you're not comfortable with a chop saw or you don't have that, you could always use a belt sander like this and an aggressive tooth sandpaper. You'll be able to get it flat like that, and then you can do your final sanding with an orbital sander like this. You can either bring this thing from 80 grit all the way to 3000 grit and 3-stage polishing, which is very difficult, or you can get this thing to about 220 or 320 grit, very well sanded, and spray it with a top coat several times, and that will also give you a good look. Not as good as polishing, but sometimes very much easier than polishing. So after sanding, I did uncover a couple small little micro bubbles that opened up, needed to be filled, so I used UV resin. What I'm doing here is I'm using alcohol to kind of clean the dust out, and then I'm using this UV resin and a UV light to fill those small little holes, and then I'll need to sand that again. Hey guys, if you want to help support the channel, I have some awesome shirts. I Love Resin shirt, Resin Time Studio shirt, Resin God shirt for all you experts in resin and want to show off to your friends, and a special shirt for anyone who has used deep pour epoxy. For this project, my plan is to use a lacquer top coat, and so basically I have this piece sanded, I have the holes filled, I have it sanded to about 220 or 320, and I'm gonna do 2 or 3 coats of this. It's actually vehicle lacquer top coat, high gloss. So for the base of this, I've got some zebra wood that I got a while back for special projects such as this. And so my plan is to put the lights in the bottom. So there's 2 ways you can go about doing this. Actually, now that I think about it, I should have done the easier way. One way is to route out the wood, because you're always going to need space for the actual lights and the wiring. You know, usually it's about 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch, maybe even a 1/2 inch. Another easier thing to do is to actually go upwards. So have your block down on here and then add a small piece of trim, which I do later because it's really hard to get a super tight fit to where you don't have any light showing through. You could, and you'll see once I get this piece together, there's always a slight crack that light shines through. You could caulk it. You could use like a black caulking, or even silicone caulking, or you can do like I did. I added a small piece of trim, which actually makes it look better, and it helps hide any little cracks or unevenness when you're trying to route out something like this, like what I did. So for all my lights, I use a 12-volt base system. So what that is similar to almost like a phone charger or any kind of DC charger. There's a little box that's the inverter that plugs into the wall, and it's usually a thin cord. It's usually thinner than any regular kind of cord that's designed for AC electric, which is any kind of regular cord. DC is direct current and AC is alternate current. DC is anything kind of battery related, or I don't think there's any batteries in here, but for whatever reason these LED lights are DC, and most LED lights are. I use a 12 volt, so I've got a bunch of connectors that are 12 volt based that have the inverter plugs into the wall, and then I also have a plug female piece that I can connect to these lights, so that way all I ever need are these 12 volt LED light strips, or any kind of 12 volt LED light. I solder the red to the positives and black to the negatives, just like if you look at your battery in your car under the hood, it's always red for positive, black for negative. And then basically you're just making sure everything is connected together. What I do have here is one tip I do recommend for soldering these joints is use a slightly bigger tip than what you think is needed. The first couple times I did this, I was using a small tip, and you think a smaller tip would be better because you're doing really intricate small little joints and connections, but actually a bigger tip works better. So what I do is I load up the wire that I'm cutting in between here. I kind of measure it out, I cut it, I strip it, and then I put some solder on each piece, and then when I'm ready to connect it, I just put it on tab on the metal part, and I touch it with the solder, the hot part, and just a single little touch for a second and let it dry, and then it's stuck together. But I really wanted to show this process because this can be sometimes the most complicated part of designing a light like this. And some of the smaller lights, you know, you get a little light kit, fairy lights, you know, on Amazon and stuff like that. It's just not strong enough for something like this. So if you can learn, you know, buy this little, if you look in the link in my description, I have all this little soldering stuff that I use. It came as one whole kit. I didn't pay that much for it, and it works great. I've used it probably 10 or 15 times by now, and this is just what I've learned. That's the little piece that I got that will connect me to the part that actually plugs into the wall. So basically there's only a couple components I need for any project. I just need some extra wire, I need the light, whether it's LED light strips or a separate light, this little connector piece, and then the piece that plugs into the wall, and that's all I need. And like I said, I have links to all the stuff I use in my description, so that way if you want to get this stuff, just follow the links and you'll get the same stuff that I use. Okay, so change of plans. Initially there was not supposed to be any kind of holes or anything drilled in here, but a mistake I made is I added too much white, and that whole cube came out much more opaque than I planned. It doesn't look like it's too bad, but even with this amount of lights here, you can see I turn it on right there, you can barely see it. And if you turn off the lights, it is a night light, but it's not very bright, and it's not the effect that I was going for. So what I have to do here is get rid of as much epoxy in the center as I can, so that way the more epoxy I get rid of, the more transparent it will be. I'll get rid of a lot of that opaqueness, and the walls will be thinner, and it'll be a brighter night light. So this is just the fact of working with epoxy and doing these crazy projects, are that you need to be flexible, and you kind of need to be able to shift your plans at any given time, because a lot of this is just trial and error. So at this point I am cutting the little trim pieces that's going to go around the edge. If you don't have a table saw, or you're not comfortable doing stuff like this, which it is quite dangerous, but I am very experienced. Another option you could use is you could probably find some wood that's around this size already, and then you could just use a hand saw or any kind of miter jig saw set that you can get your hands on. Or you could just tape both sides and use some black caulking, or whatever color caulking you want to use, and you could caulk that edge, and that would look pretty good. Just doing some light hand sanding with 120 or 220 grit here. So before I mount this block of resin to the base, I'm just going to go over all my connections and try to glue down anything that's protruding up a little high. Some of the wires are sticking up just a little bit, and also I like to hot glue the connections just to keep them tight, just in case I got to ship any of this, or any bumps or anything like that doesn't knock any connections free. It just kind of locks it in. And just doing a final sanding before I put on it's an oil wax mixture for the wood. This is just some black acrylic art paint for the wood trim that's going to go around the base, just to make that nice and black and pretty much a matte finish. This finish here you can get at most box stores. It's just like a orange oils and beeswax mixture. So the fit on this was a little tight, and I'm just using a Dremel and a little attachment bit to just take off, just like a millimeter. So here's my little trick for doing top coats in a dusty shop, is I have some large Tupperware bins where I can spray the top coat on and quickly put the top on and keep it in a dust-free environment while it dries. So just getting the base here prepped, I was going to use double-sided tape, which works surprisingly well, but I realized that it wasn't going to make contact because I had so many holes in the bottom. So I resorted to the hot glue, which is a good second choice there. Now to attach my trim pieces, all I'm using is some CA glue and some activator, which will create a fast instant joint. So you spray the glue on one side and you spray the accelerator on the other side, and once you touch them together, it's going to start drying and seize up within 5 or 10 seconds. So you got to make sure you have it in the right spot because once you make the contact, it's pretty much stuck. So as you can see, once this piece goes on there, it's not exactly flush, so I'm going to need to flush that up with the belt sander. And one final little touch up, and here comes the final reveal. Hey guys, if you want to help support the channel, consider becoming a patron over at Patreon, where I will do voiceovers of every video. I normally don't do voiceovers, but I will do voiceovers for every video over on Patreon, as well as early access and extra content. And again, you can help support the channel by purchasing a t-shirt over at Teespring, link in the description. And if you like this video, check out this other video where I make another resin cube with a moon and a snowy tree in it. Also, if you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. I answer all questions and comments. And if you like the voiceovers over just the plain content and the music, let me know in the comments as well. Thank you.